Journey will not be seen tonight. TV8 San Diego.
Good evening. At 5 minutes after 2 this afternoon, Vice President Agnew resigned. His one-sentence letter of resignation to the Secretary of State made Agnew the second man in history to quit the nation's second highest office, but the first to do so under a cloud of scandal. Outside the federal courthouse in Baltimore, Agnew gave his reasons.
I believe it would be against the national interest, have a brutalizing effect on my family to go through a long 2-year struggle concerning this matter. You also may be aware of what I said in open court, that I categorically and flatly deny the assertions that have been made by the prosecutors with regard to their contentions of bribery and extortion on my part. You might also be aware that irrespective of the statements that were made by the Attorney General in open court, that the principal witnesses of the government are not being fully prosecuted in this matter, but are receiving either full or limited forms of immunity in exchange for their testimony against me.
In the Middle East today, there were dramatic and disturbing developments. Amid continued fighting, the worst of it in the air, there are reports of Russian and American action to resupply the warring parties. In the next hour, we'll have the full story of the Agnew resignation, the Middle East war, and other news.
From CBS News headquarters in New York, this is a special one-hour edition of the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. And in Washington, Eric Severide, Roger Mudd, Dan Rather, Fred Graham, Robert Pierpoint, Bob Schieffer, Marvin Kalb, Robert Shackney in Baltimore, John Hart in New York, John Lawrence in the Golan Heights, Bert Quint in the Sinai, Bob Allison in Cairo, Dean Brailis in Damascus, and Tom Fenton in Tel Aviv.
Good evening. Vice President Agnew's resignation came under the intense pressure of a federal investigation of political graft, and it was coupled with Agnew's admission that he had cheated on his income taxes, which brought him a $10,000 fine and probation for 3 years. Until today's sudden and absolute reversal, Agnew had insisted he would not quit.
Have you ever considered stepping down even temporarily until the matter is cleared up?
I have not. I will fight to prove my innocence, and that I intend to remain in the high office to which I have been twice elected.
I want to make very clear, I'm not thinking about resigning.
I will not resign if indicted. I will not resign if indicted.
Those remarks of Agnew cover a time span of roughly 9 weeks since it first became known that he was being investigated for bribery, conspiracy, extortion, and tax charges. But for all the fighting attitude he had displayed, abruptly he did what he had said he would not do. Our team of CBS News correspondents at Baltimore and Washington reports the details. First, Robert Shackney.
The extraordinary security precautions around the Baltimore Federal Courthouse today, the police, the marshals, the Secret Service agents, provided the only hint that something climactic was about to take place. But no one who knew was talking in advance about what was to happen. Not a word, not even a no comment from the Vice President's 3 lawyers as they entered the courthouse. But it was clear soon enough that this was very much more than a routine preliminary court proceeding. The Attorney General of the United States personally came to the courthouse to lead the prosecution team this day in the case of the United States versus SPIRO T. Agnew. And then in packed courtroom number 3, there was SPIRO Agnew himself walking to sit at the defense table. It was an extraordinary court scene. The Vice President and his 3 attorneys on one side. On the other, Attorney General Richardson, Assistant Attorney General Henry Peterson, the Baltimore prosecutor, U.S. Attorney George Bell, and his whole staff, including secretaries. From Judge Walter Hoffman, a warning against outcries or disturbances, and then right down to business. Did Agnew understand his rights? Yes, Your Honor, said Agnew, I do. Agnew was formally being charged with evasion of income taxes, the judge said. How did he plead? No low contender, said Agnew's lawyer, no contest. From Agnew's lawyer, the announcement to the court that at 2:05 Eastern Time today, as part of the agreement with the government, Agnew had resigned as vice president. Next, it was the Attorney General's turn to talk. The government said Richardson could have pressed charges of bribery and extortion. But to have done this, he went on, would have been likely to have inflicted on the nation serious and permanent scars, because the man next in line to the succession to the presidency would have been facing prolonged trial. Then Richardson went on to say that Agnew's resignation and his plea to the criminal charge would be punishment enough. He would recommend no imprisonment, no further prosecution. Then it was Agnew's turn. I admit that I did receive payments during the year 1967 which were not expended for political purposes. I further acknowledge that contracts were awarded by state agencies in 1967 and other years to those who made such payments, and that I was aware of such awards. I deny, Agnew went on, that the payments in any way influenced my official actions. I further assert that my acceptance of contributions was part of a long-established pattern of political fundraising in the state. At no time have I enriched myself at the expense of the public trust. All that was left then was for Judge Hoffman to approve the agreement, the plea bargaining, and the sentencing. I am persuaded, said the judge, that the national interest in the present case are so great and so compelling that the ends of justice would be better served by not sentencing Agnew to a prison term. The sentence, 3 years probation, a $10,000 fine. Then for Agnew, the court ordeal was finally over. But even though he had taken the legal step equivalent to conceding his guilt, Agnew still was not publicly admitting he had acted in a criminal matter. He would comment only briefly.
Gentlemen, I believe you've all received copies of the prepared statement that I read to the court in open court. As I said in that statement, the reason that I have changed my decision to fight this matter is because that I believe it would be against the national interest, have a brutalizing effect on my family to go through a long 2-year struggle concerning this matter. You also may be aware of what I said in open court, that I categorically and flatly deny the assertions that have been made by the prosecutors with regard to their contentions of bribery and extortion on my part. You might also be aware that irrespective of the statements that were made by the Attorney General in open court, that the principal witnesses of the government are not being fully prosecuted in this matter, but are receiving either full or limited forms of immunity in exchange for their testimony against me. I will have nothing more to say at this point. I will make an address to the nation within a few days.
And so the criminal proceedings against Spiro Agnew have come to an end with dramatic suddenness. That doesn't mean, however, that the Agnew case is over. The grand jury is still meeting. There could be indictments against some of Agnew's former associates. But for Spiro Agnew himself, no further prosecution. He's already paid the penalty for what he did. Robert Shackney, CBS News, Baltimore.
In his statement to the court, Attorney General Richardson said the evidence showed a pattern of substantial cash payments to Agnew. Fred Graham has the details, and Robert Pierpoint reports from the White House.
The payments began when Agnew was county executive of Baltimore County, continued throughout his term as governor of Maryland, and lasted until December of last year. A pattern developed. Agnew would arrange to receive payments from businessmen and contractors in exchange for government contracts. I.H. Hammerman, a Baltimore mortgage broker and real estate developer, was asked by Agnew to collect payments from consulting engineers who wished to design state roads. Jerome Wolf, director of the State Roads Commission, agreed to award contracts to the companies that paid and penalized one company that refused. Each payment was divided, 50% to Agnew, 25% to Hammerman, 25% to Wolf. Allen Green, the owner of a large engineering company, was told by Governor Agnew, and later by Agnew as vice president, that the financial burdens of the offices required outside payments. As vice president, Agnew specifically agreed to help Green obtain federal contracts. Green paid Governor and later Vice President Agnew $2,000 or $3,000 in cash, 6 to 9 times each year, for a total of about $50,000. Lester Matz, another engineering company official, agreed to pay Agnew 5% of his fees from government jobs. The payments continued after Agnew became vice president, and Matz added a $2,500 cash payment to the vice president in return for a federal contract. In all, Matz paid Agnew about $37,500. Cash was delivered to Agnew as vice president both at his suite in the Sheridan Park Hotel and at his office in the executive office building next door to the White House. Details were not given of all the state and federal contracts awarded after payoff to Agnew, but among the projects involved were the approaches to the Outer Harbor Tunnel in Baltimore and to a 3-mile-long bridge across the Chesapeake Bay, and to the $220 million bond issue used to build the tunnel and bridge, and a master plan for the federal building complex in Suitland, Maryland. The Justice Department statement accounts for about $85,000 given to Agnew, but that does not include any of the payments from Hammerman and Wolf. Agnew's conviction was for failing to pay taxes on $19,000 in 1967, an amount involving about $6,000. Because Hammerman, Wolf, Green, and Matz agreed to testify against Agnew, the Justice Department has indicated leniency toward them also. All of them, including Agnew, could still be prosecuted under state law for the same payoffs. CBS News was unable to contact state prosecutors today to determine if state charges will be filed. Fred Graham, CBS News, Washington.
The vice president's resignation became official at 2:05 this afternoon when it was handed to Secretary of State Kissinger in his White House office. But President Nixon had learned about it last night in a conversation with Agnew, according to Press Secretary Ronald Ziegler. They talked in the Oval Office from 6 to 6:40 p.m. yesterday, with President Nixon, Ziegler said, expressing to Agnew his deep sense of personal loss at the vice president's decision to resign. Ziegler reported that Mr. Nixon also expressed his appreciation for the vice president's dedicated service to the nation over the past 4.5 years, as well as his respect for Agnew in putting the interest of the nation above his personal interest. Ziegler said President Nixon played no direct role in Agnew's negotiations with the Justice Department or his decision to resign. The press secretary announced that President Nixon will promptly begin consultation with appropriate national leaders with a view to selecting Agnew's successor. Ziegler would not say exactly which national leaders, but he did explain that the consultations will include members of Congress. Ziegler also said the president expressed the hope that when a new vice president is named, Congress will move promptly to approve him. Robert Pierpoint, CBS News at the White House.
We'll be back in a minute with reaction to the resignation and the story of what happens now.
Bear-timed release aspirin. You only take it once in 8 hours. It's made to work overtime to help you wake without morning stiffness.
Republican Governor Dan Evans of Washington, the chairman of the National Governors Conference, seemed to sum up the reaction to the Agnew developments when he said, "It hit me between the eyes." Roger Mudd reports on the impact on Capitol Hill.
You can imagine what shock and disbelief there was today on Capitol Hill. Most of the marble reading rooms off the House floor were filled with members watching the World Series on TV. Without warning, there appeared on the screen the news bulletin slide, "Agnew resigns." Someone said the stunned member suddenly jumped up and began rotating aimlessly. When the initial shock had worn off, the Senate canceled its planned 2-week recess to be available for hearings on Agnew's successor. Senate Leader Mansfield, who called the resignation a tragic mistake, said the leadership will meet tomorrow to lay out the procedure. House Speaker Carl Albert said he is working on it.
I learned of the Vice President's resignation today with surprise and shock. The Vice President advised me of his action by letter. Under the Constitution, the matter is now in the hands of the President, and I have no further comment.
I had no warning whatsoever. I was on the floor of the House participating in the debate on an important amendment to the so-called Home Rule bill, and somebody came up and told me what had happened, and I, in utter disbelief, couldn't believe it.
I do not think conditions should be placed upon the president. I do not think any consideration should be given to what effect this would have on 1976, whether it would give any particular person an advantage or not, whether he would succeed or not. Political consideration should have no part in this decision.
Yes, I would support Governor Connolly. I reiterate, I have no candidate. I don't intend to propose a candidate or to suggest or discuss a candidate, but the answer to your question is, if Connolly were nominated, I would support him.
someone who has just switched parties, who's obviously primarily concerned about 1976 in its totality, I think would not be a unifying force. I don't think the Republicans would be happy, and I don't think the Democrats would be happy. He has his problems in both political parties, and I think it would be a mistake.
I'm hopeful that the President will send to the Congress a nomination that is relatively nonpartisan, a person that will not be a candidate in 1976, and someone around whom we can rally. I have a feeling that the public does not want a bitter struggle here in the Congress over the nomination of a new vice president.
The Congress, particularly the Democrats, are very apprehensive about the coming vice presidential debate. If Mr. Nixon sends up a name like Connally or Reagan or Rockefeller, the Democrats will in effect be asked to nominate the GOP's 76 presidential candidate against whom they must campaign. But if he sends up a so-called caretaker, they will be asked to approve a vice president not fully qualified. The Congress hopes and prays there will be a middle ground. Roger Mudd, CBS News, Washington.
The assassination of President Kennedy dramatized the need to modernize the archaic presidential succession procedures. Out of that came the 25th Amendment, ratified just 6.5 years ago. The amendment now puts Democratic Speaker of the House, Carl Albert, temporarily in line to succeed the president. But it also provides the method for Mr. Nixon to choose a new vice president. And more on this from Dan Rather.
Albert now has Secret Service protection. He is serving as what amounts to an interim standby. That is, before President Nixon nominates another vice president and Congress approves, should something happen to Mr. Nixon, Representative Albert would step in. Once President Nixon nominates a new vice president, the House and Senate would be asked to vote. There might be an investigation by one or more House and or Senate committees, but sooner or later, the president's nominee must have a majority vote of both houses to win approval. Former Pennsylvania Republican Governor William Scranton flew into Washington this afternoon, raising speculation that he might be Mr. Nixon's choice. California's Governor Reagan and New York's Governor Rockefeller also figure in such speculation, as do former Secretary of State William Rogers, Supreme Court Justice Warren Burger, White House Counselor Melvin Laird, former Kentucky Republican Senator John Sherman Cooper is mentioned. One of the few Democrats who is mentioned is the majority leader, Mike Mansfield. Mansfield was in the White House with Albert for consultations with the president this evening. The Republican congressional leadership was in to consult with the president earlier. John Connally, his name has long figured in the speculation as a possible choice, but the White House tonight is mum about all such speculation. One of the persons who attended this evening session with the president said that what the president wanted was the names from senators sealed in envelopes of their suggestions, which indicates that the president will not have a nominee to make public before tomorrow midday at the earliest. Dan Rather, CBS News, the White House.
We say no cat ever walked away from Frisky's Buffet. Like, if one gets nudged away from buffet turkey and giblets, he's perfectly happy with mixed grill. If another gets nosed out of beef and liver, poultry platter suits him fine. They're all that good. All 17 varieties. Yep, he may get nudged away, but no cat ever walked away from Frisky's Buffet.
Load a house full of furniture, unload a house full of furniture, where does it get you? In the neck, the back, the shoulders. What are you gonna do, huh? Absorbine Junior. It's hard-working medicine, speed up circulation when you put it on. Warmth gets deep into sore, aching muscles. Loosens them up. You work hard, ache sometimes, get Absorbine Junior. Absorbine Junior works as hard as you do. Maggie, you're beautiful.
I know.
She knows.
Vice President Agnew's descent was as meteoric as his ascent. It was he himself who said, after being handpicked to run with Mr. Nixon in 1968, the name of Spiro Agnew is not a household word. But in 5 years, it became a household word. John Hart has a sketch of the Agnew career.
The country heard about Spiro Agnew when he ran for governor of Maryland in 1966. Maryland Democrats were divided and the Republicans' chances good, except they worried about their candidate because there had been charges of conflict of interest. Democrats accused Agnew of knowing in advance the approach site for a new Chesapeake Bay bridge when he was county executive, and of buying land on the site. And he was accused of buying stock in a bank and then seeing to it the bank's deposits were swollen with county money. Agnew denied doing anything wrong in either case. More significant was the issue of race. The main argument was over open housing. Agnew, running against a conservative, took the moderate side.
I deplore the principle of segregation in housing.
The Democrats' candidate, George Mahoney, had a slogan.
I have only said that your home is your castle.
Mahoney came off as the segregationist candidate, and white Democrats and Republicans voted with blacks to make SPIRO Agnew governor. Beating Mahoney made the new governor look liberal. He had support from blacks and Jews and many of the rich. He put more blacks to work in the state government. He signed the first open housing law south of the Mason-Dixon line. He was for pollution control, tax reform, better housing, a more liberal abortion law, and against capital punishment. Then the riots, and in one night many who had seen him as a liberal began to see him otherwise. In April 1968, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, and when riots reached Maryland, Agnew got angry. He called in the black leaders, many of whom had been on the streets trying to stop the rioting, and he accused them of not standing up to revolutionary blacks like H. Rap Brown.
I've said this to you, and I threw down the gauntlet to you. I repudiate white racists. Do you repudiate black racists? Are you willing, as I am willing to repudiate the white racists, are you willing to repudiate the Carmichaels and the Grahams? Answer me. Do you repudiate Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael?
Some of the blacks walked out. Agnew didn't care. 1968 was an election year, and Agnew was for Rockefeller, and he worked a year for Rockefeller, and he called his friends in to see Rockefeller announce. But Rockefeller announced he was not going to run. He hadn't told Agnew that, and Agnew felt foolish and bitter, and estranged from liberals who, he said, had rushed past him toward the left. When President Johnson quit the campaign, Rockefeller got back in, without Agnew. Agnew had gone to see Richard Nixon, and they liked each other, and Nixon went to the convention having won the important primaries.
It is my privilege to place in nomination for the office of President of the United States the one man whom history has so clearly thrust forward, the one whom all America will recognize as a man whose time has come, the man for 1968, the Honorable Richard M. Nixon.
I have now made a decision. I shall recommend to the convention that it nominate for vice president on the Republican ticket Governor Agnew of Maryland.
I know the first question I'm going to get is, are you surprised? And the answer is, I'm stunned. I had no idea that this was going to happen. It came as a bolt out of the blue.
The name of SPIRO Agnew is hardly a household political word across the nation.
I would certainly agree with that, yes.
Would you analyze what political strength you actually do bring to a Nixon ticket?
I just can't analyze any strength I bring, and I agree with you that the name of SPIRO Agnew is not a household name.
I certainly hope that it'll become one within the next couple months.
The doubt was about Agnew, so he went out to prove that Nixon had made the right choice. He went out campaigning with humor and acrimony. It was humor when he went around saying SPIRO who, and it was acrimony when he went after the Democrats. In 1968, the main slogans was law and order. Republicans denied that was coded racism, but Agnew had trouble with his dismissal of ghettos.
didn't say I wouldn't go into ghetto areas. I've been into many of them. And to some extent, I'd have to say this, if you've seen one city slum, you've seen them all.
The New York Times brought up again the old conflict of interest questions about a land deal in Maryland, and Hubert Humphrey made a last-minute surge, but Nixon was elected, and so was Agnew.
And I can only say this, that as the vice president, I will be as loyal as a vice president has ever been to a man. Not because the job requires the loyalty, which of course it does, but because of my personal feeling about Mr. Nixon.
Will repeat after me. I, SPIRO Theodore Agnew.
I, SPIRO Theodore Agnew.
Do solemnly swear.
Do solemnly swear.
President Nixon promised Vice President Agnew big responsibilities in relations with the state governments, and Agnew said he looked forward to being productively employed for the next 4 years. The country was restless and divided. The war went on in Indochina, and the demonstrations went on here. The moratorium march on Washington in November 1969 was one of the largest. The administration was sensitive to demonstrators, and Vice President Agnew was furious.
The student now goes to college to proclaim rather than to learn. The lessons of the past are ignored and obliterated in a contemporary antagonism known as the generation gap. A spirit of national masochism prevails, encouraged by an effete core of impudent snobs who characterize themselves as intellectuals.
Political protesters were the first to feel the Agnew acid. Then there were others. People favoring busing, Democrats criticizing the administration, and journalists. Agnew struck out at the television news reporting that he distrusted and the power he thought it gave.
A concentration of power over American public opinion unknown in history. Now, what do Americans know of the men who wield this power? Of the men who produce and direct the network news, the nation knows practically nothing.
Agnew's first trip abroad was to the South Pacific and Asia. It was supposed to be a foreign policy education, a meeting with the men who held power. It ended in Vietnam, where he visited 2 carefully selected fire bases and met with President Thieu. He came back convinced the administration was making progress in the war, no matter what its critics had said.
SDS, PLP, Weatherman 1, Weatherman 2, the Revolutionary Action Movement, Panthers, Lions, hippies, yippies, tigers alike. I'd rather swap the whole damn zoo for a single platoon of the kind of young Americans I saw in Vietnam.
Between politicians and protesters, Agnew relaxed with movie stars. Frank Sinatra was later to give him some embarrassment. But Sinatra's game was golf, and he spent a lot of time as the vice president's partner. Nixon finally decided the vice president was not a liability. On a happy election night, an overwhelming mandate made the future look bright. In the coming year, Agnew turned quiet, making peace with the press and escaping the stain of Watergate. But by fall, his own problems would make that election celebration hollow and far away indeed.
The only other vice president to resign was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina on December 28, 1832. He was not renominated to serve a second term as vice president under Andrew Jackson and resigned between the convention and the inauguration to take a Senate seat.
Beautiful wood just makes this room. Believe me, it hasn't always looked like this. I tried covering it up with wax, and then I discovered Scott's Liquid Gold. Liquid Gold cleaned and conditioned the wood, brought out the color and contrast. It penetrated the wood, and that dry, faded look seemed to disappear, as well as scratches. A nice thing about Liquid Gold is it doesn't attract dust. Makes my job a lot easier. After seeing what Liquid Gold can do, use it weekly, and keep it that way. And there's the large size for the big jobs.
The old mill was turning out stone ground buckwheat in pioneer days. Hearty buckwheat pancakes and maple syrup. Early settlers throw...
Cesar Chavez, Saturday at 4.
This is NBC Nightly News, Wednesday, October 10th. Reported by John Chancellor with David Brinkley's Journal.
Good evening. Spiro T. Agnew became a private citizen today.
Washington, Eric Severide deals today with the Agnew resignation and its aftermath. Here is his analysis.
The President must act with dispatch in nominating a successor to Mr. Agnew, and the Congress must act upon it with dispatch, but not with haste. Mr. Nixon clearly did not know much more about Mr. Agnew's personal background when he chose him in '68 than McGovern knew about Senator Eagleton's background last year. So the Congress will feel obliged to investigate as best it can any nominee for the office now. Mr. Nixon could theoretically send up several names for Congress to choose from, but is not expected to do that. In fact, as a private citizen debating the then hypothetical question, he once argued against plural nominees. The Congress could start right off with a joint select committee from both chambers, but the House is not likely to agree to that, so the name will apparently go to Rules in the Senate and Judiciary in the House. The nominee must be a man widely, if not universally, felt to be of presidential caliber. Mr. Nixon can hardly do otherwise, considering the gravity of events both at home and abroad. He may be nominating his own successor 3 years hence, but that is a risk the Democratic majority has to run. They might try to insist that the nominee declare himself a non-candidate for '76, but that apparently could not be legally binding, and the drift of congressional sentiment right now seems to be against that. In fact, during the debates on the 25th Amendment, under which this action will now proceed, both Senator Bayh and Representative Seller argued against the Congress applying politically partisan standards to the nomination. Whoever the nominee is, and the name of Rockefeller has been quietly touted recently around the White House, in addition to Connally and Reagan, he will undergo a genuine scrutiny. The legislators are easy on cabinet nominees, harder on Supreme Court nominees, but this is the first time Congress will have chosen a vice president, and it cannot afford to be casual. Spiro Agnew was the most controversial vice president in living memory, but he was not driven out by his political enemies. He was driven out by his nominal political friends. Suddenly, no hostility surrounds him, only a general sadness and a concern for the national interest, which he cited today for the first time in his series of statements since last August 1st. And suddenly, too, the atmospheric surrounding the president himself have changed, at least in degree. War and the vice presidential vacancy make him again the key to action and safety. Unquestionably, he has lost much moral authority since the first of the unending scandals broke. He may now regain much of it, in part because even his opponents, many of them, want him to have it in the general interest. Later on, this Capitol will again survey the startling amount of personal wreckage within this administration and the unprecedented number of severe constitutional problems this administration has produced.
Those three men most prominently mentioned as an Agnew successor, Rockefeller, Reagan, and Connally, all expressed sadness over his resignation. They also refused to speculate about their own chances. As they put it, Rockefeller, nobody climbs to the top over the dead body of his friend. Reagan, I haven't given it any thought. Connally, I don't like to cross bridges until I come to them. News of the vice president's resignation sent prices plunging on the New York Stock Exchange. The Dow Jones Industrials closed down more than 13.5 points. Volume was 19 million shares. The average price per share dropped 36 cents on the New York Exchange and 9 cents on the American. We'll be back in a moment with the Middle East story, and I'll be here later tonight with many of my CBS News colleagues for a special one-hour report on the Agnew resignation and its consequences. That's at 10 p.m. Eastern Time over many of these CBS stations.
This is CBS.
Have you ever been tempted, I mean really tempted, to be with any man besides your husband?
From time to time, I have.
ABC TV said topical, intelligent, and perceptive. It's a film about that growing group of married couples who still resist the idea of an open marriage, but who like to try leaving it ajar.
I Could Never starts today at theaters and drive-ins everywhere.
The Great Western feeling. You'll find it all over California. Great Western has more offices to serve you than any other savings association. And so much more. It's the feeling that comes from knowing you put your savings in exactly the right place. That's the Great Western feeling.
KNXT Channel 2.
As it developed this afternoon, SPIRO Agnew has resigned as vice president. Earlier today, he pleaded no contest to a single charge of evading income taxes while governor of Maryland. He was placed on 3 years probation and fined $10,000. Even as these developments shook America, the Middle East war went on, and there were grave new developments that threatened relations between the United States and Russia. With the fighting in its 5th day, Washington charged that Russia is heavily resupplying the Egyptians and Syrians with direct transport flights. Because of that, Washington has ordered supply flights of its own to Israel. We have reports from Marvin Kalb at the State Department and Bob Schieffer at the Defense Department. First, Kalb.
The U.S. has already begun to resupply Israeli military losses. Part of the reason for this quick decision is clearly that the Israelis need help. But there's more to it than that. Since last Saturday, Secretary of State Kissinger has been trying to get the Russians to be helpful, to come up with a reasonable compromise at the UN, to stop the fighting and begin the talking between Arabs and Israelis, and secondly, to take no action that would inflame or enlarge the war. So far, much to Kissinger's disappointment, the Russians have not been helpful with a UN compromise, and they have begun airlifting military supplies to a secret air base northeast of Damascus and to Cairo. Moreover, the Russians have been encouraging other Arab states to join this conflict. None of that's helpful, though officials here are still pressing for some diplomatic formula to stop the fighting and warning as gently as possible that unless the Russians begin to help, the whole framework of East-West détente may be in trouble. So far as the details of this airlift to the Middle East, Bob Schieffer has those.
There was no public announcement of the deal, but the latest batch of U.S. weapons bound for Israel was aboard a converted Israeli jumbo jetliner, which was spotted leaving the U.S. Navy base at Norfolk, Virginia today. Newsmen said the plane carried dozens of missiles and rockets, which will be used to arm Israeli fighters. Informed sources say that under the current agreement, the United States will sell Israel a limited number of such arms. So far, only a few plane loads of equipment have gone to Israel, but it's understood that a much broader aid program is under consideration at the White House tonight. Under that program, the United States would sell the Israelis 48 Phantom jets now being used by the United States Air Force in Europe. They would be delivered immediately along with large stocks of ammunition and other war materials. While that proposal is under serious study, officials stress no final decisions have been made. So far, said one official, we've agreed to let them have a few missiles and rockets and nothing more. Bob Schieffer, CBS News, Washington.
It seems as though Jordan may be finally knuckling under to pressure from other Arab countries to join the fight. King Hussein, who warned before this latest fighting began that Israel was too tough, today called up Jordan's reserves. So far, though, they have not been committed to battle.
Today's jets depend on the air traffic controller. He depends on critical devices, some with works in a drawer. Here's another device, the solid-state works-in-a-drawer Quasar color TV, shown with simulated TV picture. Lives don't depend on it, but you rely on it for a beautiful color picture. When you look for the works-in-a-drawer TV, remember the unforgettable name, Quasar, by Motorola.
Taste. Coffee Rich pours it on, so more coffee flavor comes through.
Taste. Coffee Rich pours it on so fresh strawberries become an elegant dessert. Pour it in muffin batter so blueberry muffins melt in your mouth.
Coffee Rich, the finest quality non-dairy liquid creamer in your grocer's frozen food case. When it comes to taste, Coffee Rich really pours it on.
The Middle East war today turned into an aerial slugfest. Israeli strikes in the Golan Heights and deep into Syria and Egypt, retaliatory Egyptian raids against Israeli troops in the Sinai. And for the first time in this war, Iraqi air raids against Israeli positions on both fronts. Despite a few details of ground fighting anywhere, Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir went on television to say that Syrian forces have been driven from the Golan Heights, that Israelis are chasing them back into Syria. And Mrs. Meir said Israeli forces are gaining ground in the Sinai, but she added that the going will be tough, with Russians pumping in more supplies. She also cautioned Jordan against jumping into the fight, recalling that when it did in '67, Israel captured the west bank of the Jordan River. John Lawrence reports on today's action in the Golan Heights.
Syrian artillery shells are striking one right after another into the Israeli positions behind me. We're in a kind of no man's land where bombed-out tanks and bodies show the wreckage of the battle. The Syrian forces advanced this far before they were driven back, 10 miles inside Israeli territory, and the fighting is still furious. For 2 days now, the Syrians have been pounding this position, trying to knock it out of action. Dozens of artillery shells burst on the Israeli stronghold. The Syrian gunners are zeroed in on the target, one of the positions its own army held before Israel occupied the Golan Heights in 1967. Even Syrian jets venture over the target on bombing runs, at the risk of being shot down by the Israeli planes, which dominate these skies. So great is the Syrian desire to take this target, a massive armored unit attacked it in force all day yesterday. In one of the heaviest battles of the 5-day-old war, Syrian tanks, armored personnel carriers, and infantrymen launched a direct assault. This was the result. The Syrian force was practically annihilated. The number of soldiers killed and wounded is not yet known, but there were many. Some of the bodies lay where they fell, beside their burned-out vehicles, their rifles at their sides. It was an awesome defeat for the Syrians and a major victory for the Israelis. At least 30 tanks and half-tracks were destroyed. Among the members of the Syrian forces who were taken prisoner, according to Israeli soldiers on the scene, were 2 Russians. This has not been confirmed by Israeli military authorities, but it happened during the last war, and it may have happened again. A heavy Syrian artillery barrage blasted this Israeli tank unit, maneuvering for position right along the border. By mid-afternoon today, the shelling was so intense that the Israeli armor was forced to withdraw. Some soldiers, like this one, took cover as the rounds crashed in nearby. The border city was heavily hit. The Israelis decide, in this battle, to maneuver into a better position. This Soviet-built tank, captured during the battle, is driven away by the Israelis, one of their prizes. Israeli armored units moved forward quickly to attack the remnants of the Syrian force, driving them back to the border. They were engaged again today by other units, and once again the battle became serious. An Israeli ambulance carrying casualties from today's fighting hurries back to a hospital at the rear. The number of Israeli soldiers killed and wounded is a military secret. But the casualties of their comrades do not daunt the spirits of the Israeli soldiers as they sing a favorite song from the War of '67. When peace comes, they sing, we will be happy. John Lawrence, CBS News, in the Golan Heights near the Syrian border.
On the other major front, Israel reports that one of its units has advanced westward to the edge of the Suez Canal to link up with an outfit trapped there since the war began Saturday. More on the fighting there from Bert Quint and Bob Allison. First, Quint.
It's relatively quiet right now at this part of the Suez front near Kantara. The Israelis and the Egyptians are shelling each other a bit, but the men at this medical outpost are getting a chance to catch their breaths. The battlefront is all around them. Their job is to go out and pick up the wounded and bring them here for immediate treatment. A couple of miles ahead, several tanks wait for action at the Israeli position closest to Kantara in the canal's northern sector, held by the Egyptians. The mood of the Israelis is grimmer now than it was when they came rushing into the Sinai. Spirited still and determined, they are saddened by the toll the battle is taking on their comrades.
It was only yesterday morning that we had enough people here in Sinai and around this area to really do any effective work. In the meantime, since yesterday, we pushed them not much, maybe 30 kilometers back towards the water. Now they're standing with their backs to the water, and they don't have any bridges to cross. So either got to give up or fight it out. And from the looks of it, they're going to sit there and try and fight us out.
The fighting on the Sinai comes in spurts. Occasional tank probes, and often in the early morning, the air battles. In the last war, the Israelis knocked out their enemy's air forces at the start, on the ground. This time, it has to take them on in the air. It's not only the MiGs up here that are keeping them from wiping out the Egyptians dug in along the canal in the solid bunkers the Israelis built after the last war. It's the SAMs, the Soviet missiles, that have most hurt the planes that are Israel's greatest weapon. But to get the Egyptians out of those Israeli-built fortifications in the few miles east of the canal that they hold, the tanks will have to keep moving up in the face of the heavy Egyptian tank and artillery fire. Egypt has more tanks than Israel, and much of the Israeli army is engaged on the Syrian front. The Israelis would like to bring some of those tanks down here, but with the fighting in the north still going on, that will take time. Bert Quint, CBS News, near Kantara.
A few Western newsmen got their first look today at the Egyptian front in the southern Sinai sector. What we saw convinced us that this war has a long ways to go yet. In the area we toured near the port city of Suez, the Egyptians are running men and supplies across their pontoon bridges like traffic on 42nd Street. The Israelis have been unable to knock out the bridges because they are so easily repaired. The newsmen crossed the canal for a tour of the Bar-Lev line, where it was clear that the Israelis had gotten out in a hurry. Machine guns, rifles, and boxes of cartridges were left behind. We also took a jeep trip about 7 miles deep into the Sinai, not far from where the front is now. We saw long convoys of Egyptian trucks and armored vehicles advancing eastward despite Israeli bombardment. Perhaps most impressive of all was the morale of the troops. They're exuberant, sure of themselves, and certain that they are going to recover the entire Sinai. Bob Allison, CBS News, Cairo.
If you sometimes suffer from acid indigestion or heartburn, this powerful little medicine brings quick relief. But more than that, we took the sprightliest peppermint, the liveliest lemon, the tangiest orange, the cool, sweet, simulated flavors of wintergreen and cherry, and squeezed each into a Tums. Tums gives you quick, dependable relief. Who said medicine has to taste bad to be good? Get Tums.
Jim, when you were completely gray, you did look much older. You look so much better with just a touch of gray.
Grecian Formula 16. It's practically clear. As easy to use as water. No mess. Use it every day until you slowly, gradually get rid of just as much gray as you want. Some of it, most of it, or all of it. Then once a week or so to keep it that way.
I use Lady Grecian Formula, and he doesn't even know it.
Grecian Formula 16 and Lady Grecian Formula.
Israel said its airstrikes in Syria were carried out against widespread military targets and claimed 17 Syrian jets shot down in dogfights. Syria said the Israeli strikes hit civilian areas, and Syria claimed more than 40 Israeli jets downed. One of the Israeli targets today was Damascus Airport. Damascus itself was attacked yesterday, and there were early reports that the Russian embassy had been hit and 30 Russians killed. The reports proved erroneous. Dean Braylis reports from Damascus today.
Immediately after the Israeli warplanes bombed Damascus, there was confusion at various points where the bombs had landed. The Russians, speaking hastily, angrily, gave the impression that this had been their embassy. In fact, it was not the embassy. The embassy was not bombed. What was bombed was the Soviet Cultural Center. There have been reports from the Russians that some of their people, men, women, and children, had been present when the bombs fell.
It still is not clear how many people were killed and how many, if any, were Russian. That people were killed is unquestioned, here and in other places in Damascus. At the time of the bombing, there were Syrian students in the Soviet building learning Russian. According to the Syrian government, the attack came minutes after Syria had received and agreed to abide by the International Red Cross's 4 Geneva Conventions to respect the principles and laws of war. The Syrian government said today that this attack on Damascus and others that followed today by Israeli warplanes on civilian population centers in 3 other major Syrian cities are a result of the heavy losses that Israel is suffering in men, material, and in particular airplanes on the Syrian front. Dean Bayless, CBS News, Damascus.
Most of the film reports on the war that we see here have been censored, either by the Arabs or Israelis. From Tel Aviv, Tom Fenton reports on the Israeli censorship.
This is the first film the Army has released of Israeli casualties in the field. It's heavily censored because the subject is taboo. Faces of the wounded are not shown. Official communiques are noticeably silent about Israeli dead and wounded. But the Israeli government's decision to let the Arab armies attack first appears to have been a costly one. The handling of casualties by the Army is highly efficient. Army physicians evaluate casualties at the front, and evacuation of the seriously wounded is by helicopter. Jewish law prescribes that the dead must be buried within 24 hours, but there'll be no funerals for fallen soldiers until after the war, and no death notices. Hospitals throughout Israel have been evacuated of all but the most seriously ill civilians to make room for the wounded from the Sinai and the Golan Heights. The figures for dead and wounded will not be released until the war is over, but as the war stretches on, Israelis are gradually realizing how extensive their casualties have been. Foreign military experts believe Israel has suffered heavier losses in the first few days of this war than in the entire 1967 war. In this tiny state of 3 million persons, every casualty is a tragedy. Prime Minister Golda Meir used to have a standing order that she was to be notified every time an Israeli soldier fell. Now, there are too many for that. Tom Fenton, CBS News, Tel Aviv.
Every maker of console color TV stands behind his set with a service guarantee for up to 1 year. But after that, if something goes wrong, you pay. We think Philco solid-state color consoles are engineered better than anybody else's, so Philco stands behind them twice as long. For 2 years after delivery, we'll fix anything that's our fault. No charge for parts or labor, no fine print. Philco Ford. We think we engineer them better, so we guarantee them better.
I bet you can't get fresher tasting dentures than mine. Oh, my dentures fresh tasting. I just use Dividend. It's new. It's a denture cleanser and a freshener, too. Minty Dividend even looks different. It has 2 special stain removers. You just brush, and in no time, your dentures are clean and back where they belong. And they taste, really fresh. New Dividend, denture cleanser and, freshener.
Transportation Secretary Brinegar says the Mideast war could force the United States to fuel rationing. Brinegar said the U.S. supply would be critically affected even if just a few tanker loads of fuel get held up. Brinegar said the longer the war goes on, the sooner the United States will have to go to a rationing program. A federal court of appeals has upheld the government's Phase 4 controls on retail gasoline prices. The Washington court overturned a lower court's injunction against the controls brought in a suit by an association of retail gas dealers. Well, this is the last out in the game when the New York Mets today won the National League Championship by beating Cincinnati 7-2. Mets fans rejoiced in their typical relaxed fashion. They shouted, "We're number 1, and you've got to believe," as they scoured the field for souvenirs. The Mets now go to the World Series, which they won in 1969. Their opponent will be decided tomorrow because Baltimore beat Oakland 5-4 today in the American League playoff, giving both teams 2 wins. The House voted tonight to give home rule to Washington, D.C., all of the city except an enclave, which would include the Capitol, the White House, and Kennedy Center. The bill now goes to conference with the Senate, which voted home rule but did not provide for an enclave. Well, now Sam Ervin himself has been subpoenaed. Attorneys for former cabinet members John Mitchell and Maurice Stans want the Senate Watergate chairman to testify about some evidence given the Watergate committee, and he says he'll comply. Mitchell and Stans face trial in the Vesco campaign contribution case. Alabama Republican Congressman John Buchanan today charged that more than $5 million was spent for security at the Texas ranches of former President Lyndon Johnson. Buchanan spoke at the opening of House committee hearings into the security spending for President Nixon's homes in Key Biscayne and San Clemente.
great waffles.
Today is the first day of the rest of your life. Start right with Total.
Start eating right and watching your weight with Total. Each delicious ounce gives you 100% of the minimum daily adult requirement of vitamins and iron.
Today is the first day of the rest of your life. Start right with Total.
You're about to see a magnificent performance. The cast of characters, a simple bowl of fruit, and Polaroid's new SX70. Just touch the button, and it hands you the picture. Minutes later, you have a finished photograph of dazzling beauty. The new SX70 land camera from Polaroid.
This reporter would like to take the rare liberty of a personal word tonight on the resignation of Vice President Agnew. Because Agnew had been given the job of spearheading the administration's attacks against the press, and his charges drew a retort or two from this correspondent, there are now bound to be some who are going to suggest that we could not be more pleased than to see Agnew go. That is not so. Since Agnew violated the law, it is justice that he has been caught. But it is, as Judge Hoffman said, a tragic day in our history, and it is, of course, a tragic day for Agnew. There's no feeling of revenge here, but one of great pity. I first met Spiro Agnew in 1967, and I liked him. He was warm, friendly, witty, candid, open, qualities a newsman appreciates in a news source. And then there came that November 1969 speech that opened officially the Nixon offensive against the news media. Some of us thought it was demagoguery at its worst. And frankly, I was surprised that Agnew would lend himself to it. But he did, and because of my strong belief that the free press must fight any attempt to intimidate it, we became ideological enemies. But we would not have wished even on Spiro Agnew the disgrace in which his reputation, his hopes and dreams are smothered tonight. As Americans, we all share his tragedy. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News. Good night.
Special one-hour edition of the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. Attorney General Elliot Richardson and U.S. Attorney George Bell hold a news conference on the Agnew situation tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, which will be broadcast live tomorrow at 11 a.m. on CBS.
Get a bucket of chicken, have a barrel of fun, say goodbye to the routine dinner time ho-hum.
Get a bucket of chicken, finger-licking good, have a barrel of fun, goodbye ho-hum. Get Kentucky Fried Chicken, come on everyone. America loves what the Colonel cooks, finger-licking good time, barrel of fun.
He had more news than he needed.
With the action in the Mediterranean, in the Far East, the Middle East now, and this leadership, I just don't know who to look forward to. It just seems like the whole thing is just in such a mess.
Tonight we'll look at how today's developments, the resignation and sentencing in federal court of Vice President Agnew, will affect the nation. Good evening, I'm Harry Reisner. This is the second time in American history that a vice president has stepped out of his office. The last time was in December of 1832, when John C. Calhoun resigned after years of disagreement with President Andrew Jackson to be appointed to the Senate. 7 other vice presidents have died in office. With the vice presidency now vacant, the man next in line to govern the United States, should anything happen to President Nixon, is Carl Albert, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Albert is a Democrat from Oklahoma. After Albert, the line of succession under the Constitution and the law leads to the President pro tem of the Senate. That man is Democrat James Eastland of Mississippi. But the immediate questions are, who will replace Spiro Agnew as vice president? What prompted him to resign? We'll examine these questions in just a moment when we resume our coverage of Vice President Agnew's resignation after this brief pause.